This is I will going away from the I'm taking you somewhere else. I'm taking you to 17th century Naples. Throughout the early modern period, privateering was a widely spread practice in the Mediterranean, where thousands of people fell victims of the incursions that Muslim and Christian pirates and corsairs were conducting against each other, both at the sea and along the coast. The people constituting this human booty were then brought to the lands of the infidel, the kafir, that was a shared term that was used by both sides, where they were deprived of their freedom and they were kept as slaves. In this historical and geographical context, the main economical reason for capturing slaves was asking a ransom for their release. In Christian Europe, the task of ransoming slaves through the payment of the price requested by the captors was mostly carried out by secular but more often religious institutions that felt the moral obligation to rescue their co-religionists from the danger of embracing Islam. Each institution developed its own procedure to ensure that slaves to be freed were true Christians, had no economical means to personally provide for their ransom. And then these institutions were to locate and identify the slave, to purchase or exchange with something else, and bring the slave back home, where the slave had to prove again his identity and the fact that the ransom had actually taken place. This process produced a large number of papers written and exchanged by different actors taking part in the ransom procedure, and papers that were often traveling with the slave during their journey back home. The kind of papers I would like to present and discuss today here in this virtual paper were produced in the context of the very efficient ransoming procedure that was developed by the Pio Monte della Misericordia, that was a secular institution operating in Naples starting from the beginning of the 17th century. In this slide, you see the facade of the building of the Pio Monte that is still in use, even though this engraving is an early 18th century reproduction of the building. I've been working on and off on the reach and still only partially explored documentation kept in the Piemonte for many years now. And in my previous studies, I concentrated my attention mostly on the role that this institution played in ransoming slaves from Turkish hands within the Neapolitan and Southern Italian context. Ransoming slaves was one of the most important charitable activities of the Pio Monte della Misericordia that were based on the contemporary, let's say, interpretation of the 7 works of mercy, hence the name of the institution. However, the contribution that this institution gave for almost 200 centuries to the freedom of hundreds of slaves had been completely overlooked. Maybe some of you know about the Pio Monte della Misericordia because in the church of this institution is kept this famous Caravaggio's painting called The 7 Works of Mercy that was commissioned by the Pio Monte to Caravaggio during his Neapolitan stay in 1607. While I let you enjoy a little bit more this beautiful painting, I want to explain a little bit more what I have analyzed before about this archive. In particular, I analyzed the documentation in different languages, Ottoman, Italian, French, occasionally also English, produced before, during, and after ransoming of the slaves. And I focused in particular on the collection of documents in Ottoman Turkish represented by the so-called Utkname or Utakname, which were letters of freedom. I don't know whether Ian will allow me to call them safe conducts. I will ask him later. That were received by the slave from their Ottoman owners upon their release. Another aspect of my research, inspired and partially based on the documents kept at the Pio Monte, concerned different, though intersecting visual and textual narratives, recounting how Christianity responded not only to the practical problem of ransoming slaves, but also to the moral and religious challenges that were posed by slavery. What emerged from the parallel reading of this text is that the discourse concerning the perils of conversion to Islam and the fear of turning Turk in captivity, especially for those individuals that belong to those groups that were perceived as more vulnerable, like women, for example, or young children, constituted a significant source of anxiety in early modern Christian Europe. And for these institutions operating in this field, saving a slave meant first and foremost saving their soul by the impelling danger of losing the true faith. I would like today to connect these two aspects, the materiality of the documents on one side and the construction of the rhetoric about the dangers engendered by the proximity with Islam on the other, within the framework of this conference that is focusing, among the other things, on the mobility of paper and the movements on paper and on paper-based bureaucratic apparatus, as well as within the more general framework of the PIMO project, connecting the motion and the movement of things, ideas, and people and paper to their emotional dimension. The documents I will focus on is a small but yet significant collection of 12 letters dated between July 1638 and September 1688 that were written by Napolitan slaves kept prisoners in different cities of North Africa. These letters are a source of remarkable historical interest since they provide us with precious information about the slaves themselves, but also about the active role they played, or at least they tried to play, to return free, but also gives us a bit of a glimpse on the emotion and the intimate feelings each one of these slaves was experiencing during their enslavement. Before delving into analysis of this corpus of letters, I would like to describe briefly the documentation that was produced and exchanged by the different actors in order to redeem a slave. First of all, since the Piedmont had clear norms regulating who could apply for their financial support and which priority they had, for example, women and children had to be ransomed first, Neapolitans had to be ransomed before the other subject of the southern Italian provinces, there were certain rules. Slaves, but more often their relatives, had to write a memoriale. No? They had to write this memoriale that was a sort of petition in which they were officially presenting their case. This petition contained all the information necessary to establish whether the slave could apply for the help and which priority they had. The petition was often accompanied by other documents, and like the FEDI were kind of certification that were attesting that the slaves had been baptized, or that were attesting that the family was very poor. And also sometimes the memoriale was accompanied by the letters of the slave I was referring to. After the institution had checked that the slave could apply for support, they would issue this document called Albarano, that was a document officially announcing the promise of repayment to whoever could ransom the slave. Generally, it was a merchant who could anticipate the money for the transaction. This merchant would then bring back the slave in Naples and would get paid back. But this could only happen if the merchant can produce a notarial deed that was basically a contract testifying that the transaction of the ransoming had taken place, and also the note of expenses that was instead listing all the expenses that he had incurred in while bringing the slave back home. Finally, there were the letters of freedom, both in Ottoman Turkish and in Italian, that they were given probably directly to the slave, so they could safely go back home. As far as the materiality of these documents is concerned, the Ottoman manumission paper are particularly interesting because they still bear traces. I don't know whether you can see it, but of the fact that they were folded to form a little square, and they very, very small, so that they could probably be carried by the slave on himself, probably in a pocket or hidden in a safe place. In this bureaucracy for freedom, letters of the slaves were not an essential document. They were probably accompanying the memoriale, but they were not essential. But they still constitute a valuable document. They must have not have been very easy to come by, if we consider that in an archive containing thousands of documents, I only could find 12. But why and how the slaves were writing these letters and what we can learn from them. Writing letters had for the slave the major purpose of informing their families about their enslavement. Sending news back home must have been one of the first worries the slave had, especially if the capture had happened far away from home. Slaves wanted to inform, first of all, that they were alive, but also they wanted to communicate where they were kept as prisoners, the name of their owners, and how much was needed for their release. So that back home, the family could start immediately the necessary procedure to promote their ransom, usually hoping that a charitable institution will take up their case. It is interesting to note how these letters, though, were not simply a list of information, but they were clearly addressed to a certain public and used a language designed to have a persuasive or impressive effect. All the slaves seemed to be well aware of the fact that their letters were going to be used as a proof of their condition, which had therefore to be described with a great care. They were also aware of the ideological motivation on which was based the activity of the various Christian ransoming institutions. Here, for example, what this slave called Diego Mimo writes from Tunis to his father on the 15th of August, 1650. I'm writing this letter to inform you that I'm in good health, but it would be better for me to be dead because I'm in Tunis, slave of a pasha of this city, who is the cruelest pagan in the world, enemy of the faith of Christ. You shackled my hands and feet and inflicts me thousands martyrdoms to make me deny the name of Christ and his holy faith. I'm ready, though, to tolerate everything with patience and die as a Christian for the name of Christ and his mother, the Virgin Mary. Another slave, for example, tell us having been in danger of death, he was mostly scared of dying in poter di can, in the power of a dog, and he implores God's mercy to make him die as a Christian. There is a lot of phrases like that. The slaves described themselves, for example, as souls in torment, suffering the pains of hell, or souls in purgatory awaiting for eternal glory, and so on and so forth. But were these torments real? If the raison d'etre of capturing slaves was almost exclusively that of asking a ransoming price for their freedom, why Muslim owners should have been so concerned to turn their slave to Islam? In this way, they would have lost a main source of income without considering that forced conversion are not encouraged, are actually quite, are not are not encouraged by Islam. Why then the slaves were using these images, evoking the constant danger of losing the true faith? It is interesting to this end to note also that in contemporary historical and iconographical sources of the time, Christian slaves were often described and depicted in the same way the slaves were describing and depicting himself. One of the pragmatic aims of these visual and textual images was to move the observers to piety, so that they would finance through offers and alms the ransoming operation of different institutions. The slaves, must have been well aware of this, and they were reproducing in their letters the same kind of rhetoric. claiming of being in danger of losing their faith will justify the intervention of the institution they sought help from, and at the same time would probably accelerate this process, giving them maybe, who knows, priority over other slaves. Even though it was not infrequent for slaves to convert to Islam, and we cannot exclude the possibility that probably some owners would try to convince their slave to become Muslim, the pressure might have also been of another kind. A slave named Costanzo Mele, for example, informs his son that since he received a letter from him, his owner tormented him every day. The daily torments the slaves alludes to were probably due to the persistent request of his owner, who, having seen with the arrival of the letter the interest of his family, was putting pressure on him to accelerate the ransoming transaction. Analogously, we could not otherwise justify the total absence of censorship in this letter, in which sometimes the slave used very insulting words towards the owners. If their ultimate intent was that of turning their slaves by any means into Muslim, why they would not try to prevent them to contact their families, or why they would let them write letters at all. Another aspect which emerged quite clearly from this letter is that the slaves were well informed about the activities of the ransoming institution and of the different channels that could lead them to get their freedom back. Slaves were, in other words, playing an active role, not only in informing their families, but also suggesting them the proper way through which they could activate the ransoming machine. All slaves seemed to know the system, how the system worked. They knew how the system worked, even though some of them appear better informed than the other. I had now a series of examples on how the slaves knew how the system worked, but maybe I trust you to trust me. And I go to the last bit of my presentation to keep the time correctly, to keep in time, sorry. Basically, the slaves were in contact with each other, were exchanged. From the letters, it's clear that they were in contact with each other, and they were constantly exchanging information, also now to get their freedom back. I want to conclude now, just to go to the last part of my presentation very briefly, to show how from this letter we can also get a glimpse of the emotional self of these slaves. Because by reading these letters, we can sense that there is a continuous and agonizing worry about not being able to communicate, not being able to send letters, or to get news from their families. One slave, for example, Paolo Bottigliero, writes on the 25th of September, 1688, he writes to his aunt telling her that he has received 3 different letters from her, but at the same time, since the woman was complaining that she never received an answer back, he continues, he says that he had wasted the whole ream of paper, and it was very misfortune. It was a real misfortune that he could not communicate with her, since he was using any possible opportunity to send her letters. Also, another slave, Diego Mimmo, warned his father that his owner will probably leave Tunis soon, and to go to the Levant, in which case he says, I better consider myself dead, since it will be impossible for you to find me again. So this sense of anxiety, this deep worry that not to be able to get in contact. The desperation of not receiving through a letter the other feeling that emerges from this letter, even if the vocabulary is almost very similar, because probably these slaves were not writing the letters themselves, but they were using people who could write letters for them. But even if the vocabulary is the same, the feeling is clearly they're clearly sincere. Many slaves lament that they don't get consolazione, they don't get consolation, and they have the fear of being forgotten. But these feelings are also directly connected with the anxiety of not knowing what's happening to their families back home. And sometimes to the sorrow of getting bad or alarming news, like slaves learns that one of his relatives died, or another one is very worried about when he heard the news about a new plague outbreak. But the emotion that emerges most of all is this sense of hope, the feeling. This is the feeling that pervades most of this letter. At the end, and is also the end of my presentation, at the end of this, most of this letter, next to the address of the recipient, there is a final sentence. This sentence says, lettera di povero schiavo, Dio la cammina, which Dio la cammina, letter of a poor slave is walked by God. So ultimately, slaves were entrusting their fate, their hopes, and also their letters in God's hand. At the same time, the 12 slaves that somehow authored this letter were also clearly, actively hopeful that their hope was real, was active, to the point that rather than being armless people trusting passively in God's help, they were very determined in taking an active role in shaping their own destiny and in trying to participate as much as they could, of course, in the complicated process that would make them regain their freedom.